Hey, everybody. I want to thank you for joining our newest webinar. Obviously, it's today, and want to just thank JR. JR, you've been with us twice, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of go through the things that I need to at the beginning, as we always do. You guys, we're going to learn today more about advanced wearables, what it is, how exciting, and how we can use them until hopefully we find a treatment, that these are things that we can employ that will help our lives and benefit our lives tremendously, hopefully soon here, that will get us, that will bridge the gap, I think is the best way to put it. We have a couple things that I want to do is make sure that we always thank our sponsors, which is a very big deal. And that they would be Santen, Genentech, Biogen, and Spark Therapeutics, as they provide funding for us to conduct these. So a generous thank you to our sponsors. As JR is loading up his PowerPoint presentation, I just want to let everyone know how fortunate the CRF is to have this gentleman. Not only is he one of our family as a CHMer, right? He is sits on our board of directors, and he's doing incredible work on advanced technology. And I'm going to brag on you for a minute. I'm going to sound like a mom because I printed this off.
Appreciate that.
And so you guys listen to this. So JR is on our website too, but you can, and we will be recording this, and we will be taking your questions probably throughout his presentation, because some of it is very specific to what he is going to be speaking on. So if you have a question about a specific point or a reference or a device, feel free to use that chat bar, and that's my job. So for JR Rizzo, which is one of the best names I can think of, Rizzo, I'm a hockey person, so it's perfect. He is a physician. You are a physician scientist, and you're serving as the director of innovation for physical medicine and rehabilitation, with cross appointments from the Department of Neurology and the departments of biomedical and mechanical and aerospace engineering. How do you get that done so quickly in such a short span of time, sir? How did you do that?
Gracious colleagues.
Wow. Well, we are, as I said, we're really grateful that you're here today. We have a good amount of people that are watching, and I will tell you that many, many people watch the recordings online, so on YouTube. So we're super excited. I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to turn off my stuff and turn it over to you. But thank you again so much for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for Beth for having me, and I really appreciate the board and Kathy, the executive director, and everyone at the CRF family for having us. And from really being a young teen when I was first exposed to the Choroideremia Research Foundation, it's really been an inspiration for me to know that you all are just doing great work and supporting great work. And it's really important for me to make sure we pay it forward and continue to do really disruptive things in the space. So let me share screen here and make sure I could pull up my slides and then go in slideshow mode. Are you seeing my notes or the right screen?
Sorry, I had to unmute. We actually see.
You seeing slide preview, or do you see the actual slides?
We see the actual slides.
Okay, great.
Well, actually, the next slide. So it's kind of both. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Let me swap screens. Is that better?
There you go. Yep, that's better.
Okay, excellent. And then what I'm going to do as well is actually, okay, I think we're fine. So let me know, am I still coming through clear in terms of mic? I have a couple of monitors here since I am low vision myself, so I'm going to use my display monitor, et cetera, to look at my slides here. Really exciting to be here again. And I apologize, for the delays. And, we're really excited to present some of this work and to get your thoughts. As we move forward towards a cure for choroideremia, a lot of us are going to be left with stable vision, meaning our current disease state's not going to progress any longer, but we're still going to have impairment that we need to handle. And, there are going to be, specific associated disabilities with regards to that, whether it is navigation, wayfinding, et cetera. And it's very important for us to make sure that we maintain safety at all times. And we've been working for a number of years to try and build advanced wearables and different mobile applications, and really more broadly assistive technologies to work on access barriers and to really improve function for persons with visual disability, but also now more broadly disability in general. So, I'm really pleased to be here to talk a little bit about what I've entitled this kind of talk of all talks on advanced wearables, a state of the union for advanced wearables and blindness and visual impairment. So just in terms of housekeeping, I do have some disclosures as presently delineated. We have 8 federally funded projects right now. I do serve as an advisor on several companies and also provide advice through several scientific advisory boards. Okay. Here what I'm going to do is play for you several virtual reality simulations to depict really the fact that vision loss and its functional consequences can be so profound. More specifically, I have 3 simulations to model the visual impairments of age-related macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, and glaucoma during a treasure hunt task. And for those who can follow along, I'd like you to see what these experiences are like as you navigate with these masks deployed for these different conditions in these simulations. And we'll start off with the virtual reality demo. Oh, that hasn't started yet, has it? Hold on, let me see if there it goes. Hopefully that's playing for you all. Beth, please let me know if it's not. As you navigate, so age-related macular degeneration with that central loss, is severe difficulties navigating this virtual space to try and find these different small treasures in this kind of hunting task. Diabetic retinopathy having a number of scotomas or smaller field losses throughout one's peripheral field. And then lastly, glaucoma, or what we may experience, or many of us experience with choroideremia, which is severe tunnel vision. So for those who weren't able to follow the animations, here I have 5 static views of our very own NYU Langone Health ambulatory care building. This is where I work. You could see a kind of a nice, clear, pristine view in the very center. And this is the front entrance to the building. Our lab is on the 17th floor. And in the corners, you'll see 4 additional views with superimposed visual masks to represent condition-specific changes. And we have here macular degeneration in the upper left, diabetic retinopathy, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can get a sense of what it would look like with each of these conditions as compared to that pristine view in the very center of that panoramic image. Okay, so I know this group and many who will be listening to this webinar know the magnitude of the problem with BVI, but I'll briefly mention it. About 27 million American adults age 18 and older report vision loss. And the thing that we've been very concerned about is how impaired vision constrains mobility. And unfortunately, the downstream consequences of that is that unemployment rates peak as high as 81%. And so gainful employment is very low. There are associated quality of life losses and a whole host of functional dependencies. And unfortunately, as we go out decade by decade from 2020 to 30, 40, and 50, many of these conditions, such as ARMD and diabetic retinopathy, are set to double, if not quadruple. And we're in for a whole host of additional visual pathology as time goes on, and we become a more aged society in general. So what are we doing in terms of mobility solutions? Well, I am a disability doctor who has a visual disability. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have a number of solutions that we've devised over the years with some of our assistive technology experts, some of them in occupational therapy. We have amazing things for those with spinal cord injury, power chairs, some of which are now driving themselves very impressively, all different types of manual wheelchairs, et cetera. But on the sensory side, from a mobility standpoint, within the assistive technology umbrella, aside from a number of electronic tools that really haven't picked up a lot of speed, aside from some GPS apps, we're really falling back on the white cane, or in certain cases, guide dogs. And, here's a quote out of Robel Emerson's group at Western Michigan. He's probably the best cane researcher in the country, if not the world. Most cane users, unfortunately, do not adhere to classic descriptions of proper cane use, and that leads to problems. And those problems lead to mobility incidents. So here we have a slide where this has been systematically investigated, and there are a number of mobility incidents, whether they define those as contacts of the body with other objects, when you're undergoing a navigation task, kind of searching with the hand in terms of digital exploration, or sometimes with the feet, loss of balance, veering off path, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is very dependent both on environmental condition, which can unfortunately make the situation much worse, as I'm sure many of us have experienced with issues with glare, or perhaps at dusk or at nighttime with nyctalopia, which those within the choroideremia family suffer from. And then, of course, performance associated with how well do we use residual vision, and what is left within our field and or central vision or macula. And of course, this being dependent on our ability to scan spaces appropriately. So what we like to consider this in the lab is really this kind of immobility downward spiral, and obesity risk gets knocked up. There's a stroke risk that really goes up significantly, 2 to 3-fold. The diabetes risk that goes up significantly. Fall risk is up 3-fold. Hip fractures, you're 4 times more likely to have a hip fracture. Depression risk, clinical depression, 3 times higher. And unfortunately, in the third world, life expectancy, mortality, usually you shave off about 15 to 20 years of life expectancy. It's very sad. Well, for a number of years, the automobile industry has been working on amazing things and actually getting cars to drive themselves. So all is not lost. And what can we do to harness technology from the 21st century, or their 4th industrial revolution, to help others? So if you're not familiar with the driverless car sector, many cars these days are dependent on what are called advanced driver assist systems, or ADASs. And these are systems that aid the driver and worker to increase road safety. And, you can think of these things as your classic blind spot warning systems that you're now seeing in cars, lane departure warning systems, collision warning systems, cruise control assistance, et cetera. And what's been amazing is actually the legislation that's now built around them. As a matter of fact, makes and models of cars in both the European Union and now in the United States mandate that you have to have ADASs built into cars that are currently released in the commercial marketplace. And what's astounding, and here's some old data, and I do that intentionally, is that these systems have cut down significantly on collision. So even if we go back almost a decade, and you look at forward collision warnings or automatic emergency braking systems, rear end striking was cut down by 40%. And these numbers are much more impressive now. So we're cutting down on about half of some of the collisions that we used to know in the automobile sector. And a lot of this is dependent on the evolution of distance and ranging technologies and computer vision. And what can we do now for those with disabilities within the pedestrian space? So those are some of the questions that we've been trying to ask in the lab, and seeing if we can address things like slip, trips, and falls, and using these ADAS systems, but perhaps more aptly called APASs, for advanced pedestrian assist systems. So here's one kind of embodiment, or one view of what we call the vision system, or a visually impaired smart service system for spatial intelligence and onboard navigation. It's really nothing more than a couple of sensors that are scaffolded right into the book bag straps of a backpack that you would wear when going to get groceries or to throw some book bags in. There's a really cool haptic interface or feedback belt that's built into the waist straps to redistribute payload, as you may have experienced when wearing a hiking book bag. And this is tethered to a small embedded system or a little processing unit inside the book bag, like a little computer. We're now looking at how to use the cell phone as a gateway tool for that as well, and potentially even a replacement. And then a bone conduction binaural headset, which you can see visualized at the top. So to dig into a little bit more details, we also have some microphones on the book bag that we're currently working with in the prototypes that we have in the field. We also integrate really cool high-end GPS receivers, or what are called GNSS receivers. This is some more specifics on the type of specific embedded system that we're using, which is a platform from NVIDIA, which you may have heard about these days. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you a couple of broad strokes about what we would need to do in order to build a comprehensive platform. And, when we have people come in the lab, a lot of times they talk about these new apps or these new devices that can really maintain or help with some function in very particular use cases. Or sometimes they're really kind of ascribed to the parlor trick phenomenon, or they can, be cool for a couple of things, but they really don't address comprehensive needs from a person with a visual disability. So what we've set out to do is to really, in a detailed way, study the urban landscape and the environment. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that means. We've also been, in a very detailed way, been mapping the environment and localizing you within those maps of that environment. And I'll unpack that for you. Then I'm going to take you down a little bit of a journey in terms of how we're reconstructing the environment and how we can use those reconstructions for better navigation and wayfinding in these smarter service systems. And then, and more of kind of a basic or fundamental level, we're going to talk a little bit about what's needed to both process the data and also to send the data and get into the details, just like Tesla, you may have heard about, is using videos or stereo cameras to move forward with their autonomous scheme as they move forward towards SAE, or the Society of Automotive Engineers level 4 and 5, which is getting towards complete autonomy. What they need to do with both video compression, so adaptive video coding, and also transmission policies if we're going to do things over Wi-Fi or over satellite communication. And then lastly, if time permits, I'll tell you a little bit about a new mobile application that we're building in the lab, and hopefully we'll be able to disseminate shortly. So what are we doing to study the environment? Well, we're trying to understand a lot more about what's in the urban landscape, including street furniture, which is a term traffic engineers use for really all those darn things that we trip on, like fire hydrants or city park benches or things like that. And then what else is going on with regards to high hazard areas? These we like to particularly focus on within construction sites, and then really kind of miscellaneous hazards. So here is part of a natural history study that we're doing with BVI and urban travel. And you can see views from the book bag as individuals with low or little vision are navigating New York City. And you can see these views from either a 360 camera, wide angle cameras, or some of our panoramic images from the small sensors we have embedded right in the book bags that we're currently using while navigating. And you can see navigating through zebra stripes or the continental stripes. We're picking up pedestrian signals. We're going around. Here's a bollard on the right-hand side, all different types of relevant street furniture. So what we wanted to do in terms of our plan of attack, just to give you kind of broad strokes of what we're doing, and I'm happy to take any questions on this, was to repeatedly document commutes from Lighthouse Guild, which is really a central hub for the visually impaired, to transportation access points throughout that relevant area, including both bus stops and also subway stations. And then we would quantify the number and diversity of obstacles that can impede efficient navigation. Therefore, we would construct an inventory of these objects and then look into how they vary in their predictability. So we could look at objects that are more predictable and that are kind of in fixed locations versus ones that may be more dynamic in their location and potentially pose more of a risk for a traveler, particularly one with a visual impairment. And what's important about this is this predictability relates to the cognitive reserve needed when using such a system and also engaging in navigation in an urban landscape. And you can see on the right-hand side, I have actually visualized two, kind of really unique obstacles or hazards in one commute from the subway station on 66th Street and Columbus Avenue to Lighthouse Guild. And on the upper panel in figure A, you can actually see us highlighting a signal post. What's interesting about this signal post is if you walk in the middle of the zebra stripes and you kind of follow classic approaches to center yourself to get from one side of the street to the other, you would walk smack into the middle of this signal post. So it turns out a lot of, due to legacy wiring in New York City, many avenues have actually, and unfortunately, inappropriately positioned these signal posts right in the middle of continental stripes, where we would expect to see blended curbs or accessible curbs with detectable warning surfaces, which is a big problem. So how do we identify them, and how can we communicate that information to end users? Figure B is one of my favorite ones, which is a trash can in kind of a rogue location. So New York City trash collectors are fantastic. They're incredibly strong, but they never put the damn trash can back in the same spot. So they always put it right in the middle of your intended path. So here is one if you're actually crossing east to west, where the trash can is right in the middle of your intended walkway. for path execution, which is a big problem, obviously, especially for trash cans that are not permanently fixed in space. Okay, so here are some examples of some additional high-risk obstacles, and I'm going to go into what we've tried to do in terms of an approach and a framework, including things like city park benches, what are called street sheds for construction sites, expansion joints that have fallen into disrepair, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've actually created is what we call an obstacle classification framework. And we've separated that into 4 classes based on the height of the obstacle. I have a visually impaired intern who's going into med school who's fantastic, and he's in a fun way named these trippers, stumblers, bumpers, and slammers as he's gone through this work with us. And so we have what we call ground level obstacles, short level obstacles, medium level obstacles, and tall. And respectively, that's anything below ground or kind of negative ground level up to 3 inches, anything from 3 to 2 feet, 3 inches to 2 feet for short, 2 feet to 5 feet for medium, and then tall, anything above 5 feet. And I'll give you examples of each of these. So let's get into the ground level obstacles. Well,
Hey, JR.
Yeah.
Is now a good time before you get into these specifically? We do have one question. Can I jump in, or you want to?
Yeah. No, jump in by all means.
Okay. So Brent, hey Brent, it's nice to have you here. He attends all of our webinars. Gold star. Regarding low vision persons who do not exercise, what he uses a quote, proper cane use, who decides and based on what standard? Is it the person who made that quote, the training used by O&M instructors? Just curious, and I don't mean to sound cheeky or negative. I've just never heard of that type of reference, not even from my O&M instructor. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Great question, Brent. So actually that quote comes out of Emerson's paper, where what they've actually done, which is really awesome, is use optical sensors that they put directly on the cane. And then they actually have end users who have various levels of visual impairment and also various proficiency levels, meaning some who've used the cane for many, many years and other ones who are kind of more novice users. And they put them in different obstacle courses, sometimes to actually see how well they do with identifying obstacles. And also they have really, at Western Michigan in Rob's lab, they have a really great facility. They actually have these drop-off testing areas where they have kind of more controlled environments and can look at how you would engage with steps and drop-offs, like trying to detect a curb. And what they do is they put these really cool sensors on your cane, and they use these kind of optical technologies, kind of what's used in the motion tracking world for both cinematography and also what we do in motion control research. And then they can exquisitely, at multiple times a second, like hundreds of times a second, analyze what your cane swing looks like when you're engaging with obstacles, and also what you're doing when you're engaged and trying to detect a drop-off. And unfortunately, what happens is when you're swinging a cane, they may advise you to swing a little bit wider in terms of your left, and then a little bit wider on your right, an inch or two past shoulder width, and then to maintain that arc in a reciprocating fashion with gait, right? And what they can do is they can say, okay, well, how well do you maintain that arc width? And how well you're maintaining that kind of that sync with your gait. And basically what his research has shown, unfortunately, is that in a lot of cases, it's hard to do cane travel. And, you know, we fall down and our cane practice falls apart a little bit. So we hit something, and then to get back into rhythm, we don't get into rhythm that well. And so our cane arc gets compromised, or the rate at which we kind of sync back up with gait isn't as good. And so what happens by and large is cane adherence to like what you're supposed to do with maintaining width for appropriate coverage, and the consistency with which you maintain that standard, unfortunately, is not very strong. And so that's where that quote comes from. Did I answer your question? I don't know if he could enable his mic. I'm happy to interact.
It says, so proper cane use is based on successful detection of obstacles versus failure and potential wipeouts.
So it's basically the ability to use the cane when in those controlled settings. So how consistently, how well do you use, if it's maintaining the arc width when engaged in kind of an obstacle detection experiment or in a drop-off experiment, what actually happens to kind of cane technique during those experiments. So basically, yeah, same thing.
He said, got it.
Cool. Excellent. Anything else before we continue?
That's it for right now.
Okay, thanks, Beth. All right, so one of the things that I struggle with a lot in New York City, particularly in the area that I work in, there are a ton of uneven kind of asphalt chunks missing from snow plows and uneven street pavement. And so what ends up happening is, as I'm sure many of you experience, you trip. Depending on what we use for constant contact or 2-point touch with a cane, these little perturbations that are an inch or two, unfortunately, can be a big problem, because when we go through our gait cycle, we only lift the top of our foot off the ground by about an inch. So anything that's kind of in that kind of hazard zone could become a tripping hazard. Another big problem in our area is, given the way they used to lay sidewalks, the expansion joints, or the little breaks in the sidewalks, the cement blocks that you'll see, water gets in there, and when it gets cold out, water is the one liquid, right, that expands on freezing. And so it knocks these sidewalk segments up, and everyone is uneven. And there are some blocks where every other block is entirely uneven. So you have to lift your foot up a little bit higher, and these uneven sidewalk cracks, it's notorious. It's like, kind of a tripping zone, if you will. So you have to kind of hip hike in order to get through all of this. It's really walking the gauntlet. And so another fun one that we have a lot is during some of the urban rejuvenation, they put in a lot of these tree pits. And sometimes it's very hard to figure out where the end of the tree pit is in a low contrast area. And some of them have actually sunken now. And so they're 3-4 feet below ground level. And so you end up falling into these tree pits. Lastly, we've been looking at different types of blended curbs in different environments, and what the intersection geometry currently looks like. Some of my other favorites being in New York City, which is a very vibrant city. For those who have been here, is, usually on every other block, there's some construction, and they have these cable protectors and construction ramps everywhere. And they're sometimes difficult to see, and they're not always with high contrast colors, which cause problems. So let's move on to the short category, or the stumblers, as Sasaki refers to them. So if you have a tree pit, the way to actually protect pedestrians is actually to create tree guards, but this is done in an inconsistent manner in many urban areas, and all of the tree guards come in many varieties. So I've probably tripped on about 180 different types of tree guards in my day. Some of them have actually turned them into seating by some restaurants, and so you turn them into park benches. So then you have to deal with tree pits and guards with benches and people's feet as they're kind of sticking their feet out in front of your path or your travel journey. There's also a lot of cones given ongoing construction. On my typical walk to work, like today, I walked through 4 construction zones. And sometimes I do that intentionally as a masochist, because I want to understand what it's like to travel more and to put myself in those precarious environments so I can learn more. Here you see a number of different signs that are used. And unfortunately, the rule of thumb with a lot of these store managers is they intentionally want to create or impede your way so you can read the sign or what the daily special is or how good of an offer it is. So they look to make this kind of, difficult for you so you don't miss it. Or for someone who's visually impaired, you do hit it. So this is a big problem. And as we go through more of these kind of green city initiatives, we're seeing more seating. So on the right-hand side, you can actually see a very unique bench that's being put in an urban plaza, and many streets are being decommissioned and used as urban plazas now, and that becomes a big problem. I should note, for those who are able to follow along with me, in the upper right-hand corner, we have the height of the obstacle, whether or not the obstacle has movement, what type of visual field, whether it be central or peripheral field, you would use to detect that obstacle, and the predictability of that obstacle, and then what we think the impending consequence would be. That's in the upper right-hand corner of all of these. Here are some of my favorite miscellaneous objects in this category. In the morning, and then sometimes through the late morning, a lot of the storefronts will receive packages. Those packages sometimes are just left right in the middle of the sidewalk. So here you can see in the middle, there's beer basically blocking the entire sidewalk. You can't even get through. Some may say, well, you could stop and have a beverage on your way to work, but it becomes a big problem for those with visual impairment. And trash is a big problem in New York City in that we don't really have a formal kind of trash collection area or zoning that are building dependent. And so what ends up happening is trash is thrown on the street, gets put in big heaps, and oftentimes encroaches on the sidewalk. And then this is one I've personally had to deal with myself, and I've unfortunately had a friend who fell into one. Cellar doors that are left open to access the basement of many of these storefronts, which in a lot of cases are in disrepair. And when they're open, they're supposed to have a safety mechanism to block and to keep pedestrians safe. And unfortunately, in this situation, all you can see is beer kegs surrounding the opening of this cellar door. So not really doing justice. Medium level, and I'm going to zoom through some of this just to make sure we get through it, but I wanted to kind of paint the picture of the horizon. We have all different types of bike racks that are being installed, given all the micro-mobility initiatives. They come in many different shapes and sizes and are really being put everywhere. And unfortunately, in many cases, are low contrast, which creates a problem. Here you can see some that are actually used for scooters. And this is another one that I've struggled with a lot and have a few dents on my shins from, and that's bollards. So bollards are these kind of small little obstructions that are used to prevent cars from going on pedestrian walkways. They come in many different shapes or sizes. Unfortunately, many of them are actually made low contrast, so they don't really ruin the aesthetic of a landscape. And they're highly problematic during navigation. And we highlight a few of them here so you can get a sense. In all of these new urban plazas, for every one, there's all different types of benches and arrangements of benches, which means inconsistencies and problems for anyone who tries to create a mental model of how to walk through these spaces. And then we have trash cans, which I highlighted before. Here are different varieties that are all kind of put in different places on the actual street corner, which poses a problem. And then in certain cases, we have post boxes that are put in problematic locations. Some of my particular pet peeves within construction zones are how they use what are called these Jersey barriers, or these kind of triangular looking obstacles to kind of let you know that there's a construction site nearby, and how they go about putting these up, and how at each construction site on a daily basis, they have inconsistent practices with how they arrange these Jersey barriers. So once you walk through a construction site, even if you do build a mental model, that mental model is usually rendered useless from a spatial cognition standpoint on your second trip through. The cheaper ones are what are called these kind of water plastic lighter Jersey barriers, which are the, you may be familiar kind of as these barricades that they use in different construction zones. Here are some of the ones that I've literally walked through myself. You can actually see on the left-hand side, the entire sidewalk is just blocked off with these little, what are more, I would probably call more of a stanchion than an actual barrier, with wet asphalt. And no other labeling, no other construction worker giving pedestrians an indication that there's work ahead. These are the infamous waiting line belt barriers, or what are appropriately called stanchions. I don't know about anyone else on the call or in the webinar, but I've wrapped myself around about 400 of these at different airports, and I've knocked a lot of them off, which is always entertaining. They usually always happen to be black, and they're always a pain in the ass. And then figuring out wherever they want to put these, the kind of people mind is uniquely dependent on who's organizing the site. Here's some unique large signs that we've just annotated in Manhattan during different commutes. And then lastly, I'll highlight some of the bigger ones that are problematic. These new kind of very sexy chic bus shelters, which are all glass and extremely difficult to see. I've walked right into one of them in the past because I didn't see where the wall was. This is a big problem, some of which have benches in them, and some that don't. We have food carts that tend to be haphazardly arranged all over the sidewalk, and less than courteous, sometimes purveyors of food who run them. Signal posts, as I mentioned before, which can really be, unfortunately, in very inappropriate locations, and then sometimes that actually have the APS button for you to pick, so you can then, or to press, so you can then engage either the chirp or the vibrating arrow. Here are different light posts. And then another one of my favorites in construction sites are the construction and scaffolding poles. Here's a little bit about the way a construction site is built with regards to scaffolding, and the two that are really the biggest pains are both the standards, or those are the vertical posts, or what are considered the uprights, and then the guardrails in between. So when you have these construction sites and you have construction sheds, you have a lot of this construction fencing, which sometimes entirely shuts down sidewalks, and you end up having to walk in the middle of the street. Here's a nice example with a very little sign that says, please use other side. Which, for those of us who are not able to read those small signs, is very difficult, and are met with a green fence while walking down that sidewalk. You have different subway entrances. And then, of course, we have our more mobile obstacles, namely both pedestrians and vehicles of all sorts and varieties in New York City. One thing that I'll end with, which has become a big problem, and we've had several conversations on in some recent seminars, has been what's happened since the pandemic and outdoor seating in urban plazas. And so if it's not difficult enough to walk down a sidewalk, put a whole bunch of tables and chairs on both sides of a sidewalk and have people walk back and forth with signage. And then, now make that the path that you need to follow in order to get to your final destination. These have become very problematic, and we've tried to advocate for potentially using one side of the sidewalk, but there are a lot of problems with this kind of double sidewalk use, if you will, during the pandemic. So maybe I'll pause there quickly. I don't know if there are any other thoughts, Beth, or we have any other chat. I don't have.
Nope, we don't. You're good to go.
Good to go. Excellent. All right. So next up, we have a little bit about mapping the environment and what we're doing to localize those with visual impairment in the actual environment of interest. And so here I have a couple of reconstructions from some work we're doing at UN headquarters, and also kind of an overview of the key enabling technology, which is really leveraging state-of-the-art 3D computer vision and deep learning to both create a mapping pipeline to construct these really cool topometric maps around key target areas, as you can see visualized in this blue pipeline, and then to do a localization pipeline in which images captured from a cell phone or maybe an advanced wearable, just like the cameras that you saw in the book bag, can then be used to acquire an image. We can take a frame from that video and then position you within the map, kind of like almost like an image matching exercise in the localization pipeline. And so the yield of this would be to assist with both path planning and path guidance. So here we have an example from a user perspective of how one can navigate with 6 different kind of subsections of your journey in between various locations using such a technology. And to give you a little bit of a primer here, you can see us on the left-hand side walking around downtown Brooklyn and incoming images to the book bag. And then on the right-hand side of this kind of quad view of urban images from New York City, you can actually see us localizing you with the red arrow in the middle of this intersection with relatively high accuracy for an optical-based method. That same approach is now being used to develop other technologies, such as this robotic shopping cart that can help navigate an end user to different areas within a shopping store, dependent on what she's interested in. So she's stating that she wants to select some fruit and some bananas, and the cart is actually taking her to the bananas based on a map that was pre-recorded and downloaded to the actual platform that's built into the undercarriage of that shopping cart. So how does this work? I mean, a lot of you might be thinking this is kind of a tall tale, but this has actually been a technology that's been in evolution for about 10 or 11 years and a little bit longer if you go back to the first instance of it in the robotics sector. and it's largely called visual place recognition. And you can think of really taking a whole bunch of images and then tagging them in terms of geospatial coordinates, and then separating them into kind of really unique features. So we can look at an image and break it down into a bunch of pretty cool descriptors. And then we could look at a way to use those descriptors to then do image matching later on. I like to think of this as kind of turning the entire environment into a QR code, where we pick up a couple of unique signatures about like the edges or items of interest. And then we can think about what items of interest are in that particular area in this particular environment. And then if we get an image from the camera in that same environment, we get those same images and then we can match it. And if I were to just take all of the images and then try to use artificial intelligence to match the entire image, it would take minutes and minutes and hours, and it would never be tenable. We wouldn't be able to do it scientifically. But because we can create these lighter methods, we're now able to localize you in a much more efficient manner, potentially even within a split second. And that's going to be very advantageous for accessibility initiatives. So what we're doing here, is we decided to utilize a large data set from a bunch of mapping cars that were sent around New York City. And we wanted to really unpack some of the challenges of these VPR methodologies so we could extend the research into the pedestrian sector, not just focus on robots. So, obviously you have to have large scale and long-term geotagged image databases, kind of what's involved on the pre-mapping side. And then you also need the robustness of these algorithms to be really driven up to a high degree. And we need to make sure that they can work across seasonal changes. So you can imagine that a snow or rain may change the environment subtly. And if we're grabbing images, does that change the features in any way? We need to explore that. We need to explore what happens with image occlusions, because we may not always be provided the same exact image from the camera, maybe half the image. And is that enough to actually do the matching? So we took this large data set from cars in New York City. It was a company called Carmera. I'll tell you a little bit about that data set shortly. And we took views from different cameras positioned on the car. So they had these cool mapping cameras on the front of a car and on the side of the car, kind of where the rear view mirror is. And they would just drive around New York City, acquiring images of all different environments throughout the 5 boroughs. And we wanted to see, the first question was, well, since we have a pedestrian application that may have different views of the environment, are there differences between the front view and the side view of the camera? And one other thing that we thought was very of interest is one thing that comes up with anything that uses vision and cameras is anonymization. So if we remove all of the people and all of the cars in terms of from an identification standpoint, can we still do this image matching that's important? Or would this affect the performance of the system? So we basically took this data set from these cars. We highlighted the area around NYU, and we picked a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer area. We used both those front and side view images, and then we anonymized all of the views, all the images and frames from those that relevant time period, which was in 2017. All people were removed, all cars were removed, as you can see visualized on the right-hand side. The data was collected, as I mentioned, in around 2017. It started in 2016, finished in 2017, and they were collected at all different times of day, 24/7. Here's a little bit about the number of images in terms of side versus front view, and how many images we actually acquired or had in total in this data set. So, we wanted to look at things like during and after construction, which we actually had since this was a year-long data set. We wanted to look at things like summer versus winter for seasonal change, and with and without motion blur. And what we saw, which was very exciting, I won't go into any of the specifics, was that there were differences between the view of the cameras. And what we were able to do in terms of the localization was that the front view outperformed the side view, as you can see here in these accuracy plots. I'm not going to go through all the specifics, but you can basically see that these front views in the top image matching frame were more accurate as compared to the side view. And I put a box here. And then if we actually look at what was actually performed with or without the anonymization, there was actually no effect on those privacy concerns. So if you removed the people in the cars, the actual approach performed in exactly the same manner, which was very exciting. Here you can see the results for the top 5 images versus the top 1 image. And the reason we think that the front view cameras actually fared better than the side view cameras is that there were different overlap areas between the additional views provided. And that was able to give kind of a big bonus, if you will, to the image or the vision place recognition. So I'm going to skip through some of this only to say that there are some challenges in some of the side views, which is something that we'll have to handle from a pedestrian standpoint, but happily state that the pedestrian application is a much slower modality than the automobile, of course. So we believe this is actually going to be a much more robust approach than what is showing here in the automobile world. So I'm going to skip over this, and I'm going to show you here that what we're able to do in the side view versus the front view in non-blurry and low anonymization with regards to performance. I'm going to just blast through some of this and get through the takeaway just to make sure I can highlight some of the other areas. But let me highlight this one image here. So I'll pause here briefly to show that the anonymization did not affect the localization at all. And in these pictures, which you can see tiled on the upper left, you can actually see that the car that was actually removed from the frame of interest is probably occluding about 50% of the image frame on the top right, yet it had zero effect on the localization capability. So we performed just as well, which is very exciting. So you can imagine and apply or translate that into the pedestrian application, in which if we had even 50% occlusion based on something we'd already mapped with that incoming image frame, that wouldn't have any effect on performance, which is very exciting. Let me wrap up by saying, I just wanted to give you a taste for this kind of a smorgasbord of exciting new advances. VPR methods and data sets perform worse on the side view than on the front view. This is in the automobile, not in the pedestrian. We intend to explore that next. Data anonymization should be used for privacy concerns, and it does not have any performance concerns and performance costs, as we've delineated previously. We do need to work on streamlining our data collection protocols and our algorithms for side view, which we intend to do for the pedestrian applications. So, the take home is that, vision place recognition reduces dependencies on things like sensorized infrastructure for navigation. So when you go into an environment and they tell you that they have an accessibility toolkit with Bluetooth or beacons, this could be a replacement for that, or could be something that is used in conjunction with a very simple model with just a handful of beacons, as opposed to a very beacon heavy model where beacons are needed in every room. So this is a very promising enabling technology for accessible urban environments. Okay. And I'll highlight a little bit of some exciting work we're doing at the UN, where we're actually working on building an accessibility app for them using this technology. And you can actually see us recreating and localizing individuals at UN headquarters on the right-hand side here. I'm not going to get into that in the interest of time. Okay. I'll take a quick pause to see if there are any questions. That was kind of a whirlwind on vision place recognition. And I'll go into reconstruction. Any questions?
We have several, but I think it's they're more generalized that we can tuck in at the end.
Okay, sure. Beth, what do you think about time-wise? So what kind of time should we, I'm just trying to think about the rest of the talk and stop for questions.
Sure. We're scheduled to go till 3:30, Eastern. So we have about 40 more minutes, but that should include probably 15 to 20 in Q&A. Okay, so I'd say you got about 10 to 15 minutes max.
Okay, got it. So I'll probably give some briefer pictures. I just wanted to, again, introduce some of these topics, which I think are very exciting for the field, and also will involve some of the next steps for our research program. So what's happening with reconstruction of the environment? And this is some work we're doing with the MTA here in New York City. So the motivation, so, directional signs in the subway have always been difficult for me. They're really all visual media, and they're often small, and they're often kind of tucked in corners or on, convenient pillars or columns, and sometimes difficult to find. There's really no existing BVI technology designed specifically for indoor navigation in the subway system. There is one or two that are coming online. I don't know if we would consider them comprehensive solutions, but some newer technologies are coming online now. So building a 3D map of the MTA station may assist with a more detailed navigation data set for both indoor positioning and also hazard prevention. And so what we've done is we actually worked with the MTA, and we were provided detailed 2D floor plans of the Columbus Circle location, which is a very complicated subway. So we wanted to start with something ambitious and then fall back on what would be easy. The 59th Street station, just an overview, has 20 entrances and exits, 3 different floors underground, there are two-sided platforms and 4 different tracks. And there are a number of challenges when you're trying to do mapping and reconstruction in those environments. Things like moving pedestrians and inclusion, complex underground environment with multiple levels and kind of multiple areas within some of those levels, very long platforms, which make it difficult for mapping, camera shake and artifact, as you can see on the right-hand side. And so what we decided to do was to really think about it as a quilt or one large kind of patchwork approach. And so to relieve this issue of accumulation error, which is what happens in complex indoor spaces, we've developed this patchwork approach to divide the subway station into overlapping areas and then to re-register them and align them after the fact. Almost like, kind of building a model for each of the appendages, like your arms, your legs, your torso, and then rebuilding all of those, rebuilding your entire body after the fact. So here is kind of the overview of the 59th Street station, broken down into sections, and we created different overlapping areas, and we set out to then map those specific areas and then to register them to one another and then to rebuild the entire space. Technically, we're using what's called iterative closest point. It's an AI-based approach. It's not really important, but the idea is to basically fuse these different constructions into one massive point cloud where we can then recapitulate the entire space. And then, we can then have a learning-based framework that can help with map evolution. And the idea here is once you're then in that space, we could do ego motion tracking to help understand where you are and to help navigate with path planning, to help with path planning and also path guidance and path cues. And that's with the help of our camera systems that also have integrated inertial measurement units. And so this gets into a little bit of the math about how we end up figuring out where you are in your orientation within the 2D floor plan. I'm not going to belabor those points. So here are some actual reconstructions from those various sections in the 59th Street section. So this is all raw data that we've collected. Here are some actually matched areas from that 59th Street station with the actual 2D floor plan. As you can see this coming together. And now, excitingly, we've actually started to rebuild the entire station. And you can actually see now the semblance of the station on the right-hand side in these 3D models. And so what I'll do here is I'll play for you an example of the incoming video from the subway. This is a depth map on the lower left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can actually look at the mesh reconstruction that we're building of the environment that can then be used for navigation and also for hazard prevention and how detailed it is. So this is a 3-dimensional rendering of that subway station, including, turnstiles, barriers, columns, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll let this play for a second. Okay. So what we're working on now is turning into a learning-based pipeline, as I mentioned before, which is very exciting, and we're taking next steps with the MTA. I guess I won't pause for questions unless Beth, feel free to interrupt. I'm just going to move on to processing and transmitting the data.
Nope, keep going. That's great.
Okay, cool. So I think we're doing pretty well on time, actually. So if I'm going to take all these videos from these camera technologies, I need to think a little bit about video coding. So for those of us who are familiar with image sizes and resolutions, we may be familiar with what our new TVs can handle. Not all video is built equal. And a lot of the video is dependent on, video streaming is dependent on adaptive video coding or compression. And the reason this is important is we need to get prepared for what ultimately we may need to transmit, which I'll get to nextly, in the kind of big data highways that exist in the Wi-Fi networks or through satellite communication. I'll talk more about that shortly. But each of our camera systems, as you can see here, is a Z camera, and they have different recording video quality modes. Several at different frame rates. So you can look at 15 frames per second, 30 frames per second, or 60 frames per second. And depending on the resolution of those images, how good the image is itself in terms of image size, that then means the bit rates or the size of the video itself has different kind of streaming needs, which is then going to change what you need to do in terms of transmitting and then ultimately processing that information. And so when we build a platform that has 2, 3, 4 cameras, we need to think about the total amount of bit rates that would be required for streaming. And so in many environments, bandwidth is limited, and if video is compressed to lower bit rates, that's fine, but we have to then be mindful of the amount of image distortion. So very concretely, on the left-hand side, you can see 3 different pedestrian signals, right? On the left-hand side, you can see a pretty high resolution image that's recorded with a higher, that has a higher bit rate, 12.2 megabits per second. And that's probably what we would recommend if we were going to have a neural net detect and identify that pedestrian signal as a green light or safe to cross. In the middle, you can see us with reduced bit rate go down to 5.8 or 6 megabits per second. And you can start to see how the image becomes distorted. And then if I go down to under 1 megabit per second, which may actually be a reality in some environments, you can actually see the amount of image distortion. But all of this is going to accumulate and affect the performance of our actual system. And when we look at a lot of the optical detection apps that are out there, a lot of them are taking very low resolution images in order to provide service. And when we think about trying to provide more service or comprehensive service, this is very critical for next steps of our system. So you can think of what's needed in terms of compression, so we can then offload the needs from the actual device itself. Because on my book bag, I have a small computer. Can I then send it over the airwaves through Wi-Fi or through satellite communication, particularly with 5G, and then unlock a whole bunch of advanced features? And so you can see here, what's really neat is I can leverage things like cloud analytics, which you've probably heard about. And as I do more on the cloud with compressed video through transmission, I can do more computationally. I can actually, in theory, process higher resolution images. And because I'm doing it on the cloud with remote servers, I'm actually saving on my battery. So then the total life of the power cycle of my device becomes more optimal. And that's very exciting. So concretely, when I actually have my book bag, this prototype, we can look at low compression from those images. So I can compress a little bit and then I can offload that data. I can compress a lot and I could offload that data, or I could decide to just use my onboard computer and use high resolution images so I don't compress a lot, or I can take those same images, compress them a lot and process them locally. But the idea here is, what are the effects on a platform? If you were to purchase a platform and say, I want to maintain safety, I don't want to trip at all, I want to be able to maintain efficient wayfinding and navigation, what does it actually look like in terms of the system from a performance standpoint, and also a battery life standpoint, and what are the bandwidth requirements? Well, here you can actually see a color-coded scheme where in orange, if I process locally with high resolution, I don't have to worry about sending anything through the network, so my latency isn't a concern, my bandwidth isn't a concern, but it takes me a lot of time to process that information, maybe too long, and then I can strain my battery life a lot. Instead, if I compress a lot and I use low resolution information and I keep it locally, maybe I can drive my latency down a little bit. But one of the things that we're very interested in doing is what's called task partitioning. So can I do some of it on my device and actually send some of it through Wi-Fi or the satellite uplink to the cloud and actually offload some of that processing. And then you can see the green where I'm actually able to do things much faster with higher bandwidth requirements, but also save battery life, as you can see with the battery icons in terms of the green and the yellow, which is very exciting. So I don't want to get into kind of video compression too much, just to say that there are video compression engineers that have been working incredibly hard for decades to bring us streaming technology. And we're using that same streaming technology to figure out what are the adaptive video coding policies that we need to make a more powerful advanced wearable. And we can basically modify the video on several axes. So you can think about how many frames when I like burst a series of photos with my iPhone. Can I adapt the frame rate, which is in the middle here? That's temporal. Can I adapt the image size, which is the spatial size of the actual image? Or can I actually play with what's called the amplitude of the image, or quantization? And that's classically what's approached in compression technologies. Now, what's really cool is they have some neat models that can do this adaptively and with artificial intelligence. And now what we're trying to do is to see if we can optimize the system performance while figuring out how to do the AI to play with video quality. So we automatically figure out what is the best video quality to maximize our performance. And here you can see some examples where I could take my original video, a 640 by 640 at a frame rate of 15 frames per second. And then I could either do a spatial compression downsampling, where I go to 320 by 320. I can do a compressed temporal compression downsampling, or I can actually compress with what's called larger quantization step sizes. And you can see the different effects here in a commuting video. I'll play that one more time. So you see the differences in what actually happens. Now, ultimately, what are the performance differences for the actual system and the wearable when this actually comes online? And here's where it gets exciting. If you guys weren't excited already, here's where it gets exciting. So when I put all of this, if I take my uncompressed video and I do my object detection, I can detect a lot of really good things. And let's say I can consider that ground truth. Then if I start to compress all of the actual videos and then I look at the performance, what actually starts to happen? And here's what's key. When I start to do that, I start to lose the performance of my system. And if I actually look at these two frames on the left-hand side, some people may notice a pretty big difference. If I'm running I'm kind of walking across the street and I intersect with that bike path, there's a big 3-foot in diameter potted plant. And on the left-hand side in the original video, I can identify it with our computer vision and with a pretty high confidence and say, hey, listen, there's an obstacle there, avoid it, or give you a cue to avoid it. On the right-hand side with my lower bit rate in the compressed video, it's missing. So that you can clearly see that there's an effect with these compression policies and these kind of lower quality videos on detection performance. And this is very, very important. So how can we recover performance by coming up with these new policies? I'll make a couple other points on this, which I think are really kind of eye-opening, pun intended here. If you look at the effect of downsampling, here we compare objects detected in a 2K images, which is very high resolution, and a downsampled 384 by 704 video. Look at the differences in the amount of objects that I can identify on the left versus the right. So on the right-hand side, I have my high resolution. On the left side, I have the lower resolution. And you can see that I have 11 objects identified. On the right-hand side, I've doubled the amount of objects I can identify. Now, what's important about that? The important thing is I can do all types of path guidance or path planning, or figure out, should you walk down that sidewalk, or is there's too much congestion, or figure out kind of a risk ratio for if you then decide to walk down that path, or should I, have you turn left? I mean, there's all things I can do, but I have to have access to the data. And with the compression, I'm missing a lot of that key data. So that, it's very important to make sure that we have the right compression policies in place. And what's really important about this is you'll notice that pedestrian lights are included in this as well. If I want to be mindful of the fact that, is this a green light or a red light for the pedestrian? Only about less than 5% of signalized intersections in New York are actually accessible with either chirps, audio, or tactile vibrating arrows. So this is another neural net initiative that we have going to detect pedestrian signals. This is very important to make sure that we detect those optimally. And if I didn't get you at that one, this is one where it should really hit home. If I take all of these different image resolutions and I look at my ability to detect pedestrian signals at different distances, you can see on the right-hand side, at some point, I lose my ability to detect them. And so if I look at a low quality image versus a high quality image, the low quality image, I start to lose my ability to detect them at about 13 meters. On the high quality image, I can preserve that almost to about 20 meters. Now, here's what's key. Most streets in Manhattan are 20 meters. So if I'm at 13 meters using the compressed image, I can't detect the pedestrian signals until I'm already in the crosswalk. So what's the point of doing this, right? You can't use the lower resolution images. You have to use the higher resolution images. We have to get access to the ability to process those higher resolution images so we can maximize our detection range and detect more. So it's almost like kind of creating a super synthetic vision with these policies. And so we're trying to maximize this, and this is a little bit more about what's called the STAR algorithm, which was developed with Yao Wang, and who's a key collaborator of ours. Okay, I'll pause very briefly to see any last questions on that, Beth, or should we just plow through it? I think I can probably just do a quick update on that last thing.
You know, I think here's the questions, and it's pretty straightforward that several people have. How soon are these technologies available? The cost, does insurance cover it, Medicare, and are there clinical trials such as, you know, the like we have for gene therapy and other research in the biotech space? Is there training, and can we just buy as a consumer? Those are the questions that we've had so far.
So how soon, the cost, trading requirements, and did I miss, was there another one in there?
Yeah, and are there trials such as, you know, that we have for
trials.
Yep, clinical trials.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
And then those are ones, and please continue to bring in your questions.
Okay, cool. So let me run through this last kind of quick thrust, and then I'll answer those questions, but I think we'll have time, if that's okay. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, it sounds pretty good.
Okay, good. So the last one is, I told you about video compression, but then we have to figure out how to transmit it. So what's key, right? Well, everyone's talked about 5G and wireless offloading. Well, what's the deal? And so if we're doing very computationally intensive things, and as we want to do more with more cameras, it's only going to become more computationally intensive. What can we do, and how do we get access to more computational power, right? Well, the key is going to be to try and offload all of that to the cloud and to do things through edge servers, which is becoming the new reality, or through kind of cloud processing, if you will. So, you know, quick backstory for those who are unfamiliar is that 5G or millimeter wave technology is really new high frequency transmissions in the kind of the 5G spectrum range. What's really neat about it is you can have a much bigger kind of data highway, and that enables both massive data rates and also lower latency with better reliability, right? But there are some challenges with that. One is directional transmission and tracking. Some of it has to do with blockage, given what you need to do with the base stations. And then if you then use these base stations, how close do you need to position the servers to your network edge? And so what we're trying to do right now is to figure out how we can leverage 5G and potentially even 6G to come up with what we call genie policies, to send this data in unique ways, but to kind of fingerprint what the opportunities are, and then to send the data in a more or the most advantageous kind of policy or approach possible to maximize your computational opportunity, if you will. And so what we're doing right now is there are a couple of really cool tools. We're working with some electrical engineers, and we're creating these really detailed simulations in what's called this NS3 platform, which allows us to basically recreate a 5G environment, so we can then prepare for what we anticipate to happen as 5G scales. To be clear, we already have 5G base stations, but they're very low density in New York. And so we're actually using that in modeling realistic simulations to figure out how we'd want all of this to work and what we should expect in terms of using one or several camera technologies. And we're looking at things like blockage in 5G, and we're looking at 4G handovers, which I'll show you in a second. And this is one quick plot where it shows you basically what is the throughput of these different camera technologies and how much of the time can we guarantee that, right? So getting up to 50 megabits per second, which is probably would not be tenable in a 4G environment, which is what all of our cell phones are using primarily, although maybe occasionally 5G, but not really practically all that much. And what we'd be able to maintain that in terms of the amount of time. And then also lastly, the latency. So how fast can we do that? So every kind of like half a second or quarter of a second I delay, that then creates another problem in my end-to-end latency of getting that immediate feedback to you so you can make an executive decision about what to do in the environment. And we're being very ambitious, but kind of very hard-nosed about where we're putting those requirements, so we can make sure that we stick to those policies. And here you can see this handoffs. I won't go into this at a time, but the key takeaway is this 5G connectivity will really enable high data rates, sufficient for probably 2 cameras at 50 megabits per second, which is exciting, maybe even more. There's this real big opportunity for offloading, so we can do more computationally in the cloud off of the actual local device. But with blockage, these connections are intermittent, so we need to come up with these adaptive policies. When do I leverage the 4G connection? How do I leverage it? And also, how do I leverage Wi-Fi environments? So we're actually evaluating this, and we're planning for testbed deployments actually within this academic year, which is very exciting. And then lastly, I'll just pause to say that we're working on this new trip planning and trip guidance app that we're calling Commute Boost. And that we hope to be able to send out some ongoing communication about very shortly. And I can answer some questions on that as time goes on. So let me go to questions. The first one is, how soon can we get this device? I guess I'll answer that question first. We're hoping soon. The wearable system, I'm not really sure. I don't have a definitive timeline yet. What we're hoping is that in the next 1 to 2 calendar years, we'll have some type of initial version of the wearable that can be released. But what's exciting about it is we've kind of changed strategies a bit. And what we're hoping is that a lot of the approaches that are generated from these devices will help other technologies in the space, and will also help advance mobile application technologies, which is what we're doing. So we hope to have several apps that will be released that we intend to be more comprehensive, and that will also then help seed more advanced and stronger wearable platforms. So long story short, stay tuned. A lot of this depends on resources. We've had a tough time getting grants until about a year or 2 ago, and now we're kind of picking up speed. The more resources we get, the faster we can go, which is great because we can build our team. The CRF has certainly been a partner of ours. We're always looking forward to more opportunities to get more resources so we can move faster. But the horizon timeline is probably a year to 2 for an advanced wearable. Probably that will focus on mapping and localization initially, with some path planning and guidance built into it, with probably a single service, and then we'll build services on top, because it'll be an ensemble of services that will ultimately be supported by the platform. And then stay tuned probably within the next 6 months for the first mobile application. That's the first question. Maybe I should pause to see if there's any questions about that, and then I'll be prepared to read.
Super excited. No, I don't have anybody. So we have about 7, 8 folks here that are still online. So if you'd like to type out your questions, feel free to do so, folks. And you can continue to work through.
Sure. We're really trying to get the cost down to about $500 for the advanced wearable, although I'd like to see it driven down even more. And for the apps, it really depends on what type of particular service that we're going to deploy. I'm hoping that some of the apps can actually be released freely. There may be a small charge for some of the other ones, depending on the mapping and localization and how we build a model for that. We have a startup that's been picking up some steam. It's raised its first round of money. It does need some more money to move forward. We're always looking for investors. That will help determine how we move forward with the models for each of the new applications, because we do need to get them into the commercial marketplace. But in the meantime, as we're doing the research and piloting, we'll need more great friends and family members to help trial some of the tools, the applications, and the wearables. So hopefully
That's what
that
I
helps
was
answer.
thinking. We have a great amount of people that would be able to help you with this. I'm sure there'd be lots of volunteers.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And, the way I would always think about this is, I think a lot of people always look at, these as competitive. It's like, oh, I need to have a cure, or there needs to be something else, or these are definitely not conflicting at all. I mean, this doesn't detract at all from anything we would do therapeutically with gene therapy. This is only, even if you were to get gene therapy, and again, there are cures put in place, the idea would be this is just to maximize safety and efficiency. These are service systems that are meant to make your walk to work or your experience in work a more enjoyable one and a safer one. And it would work in concert and complement anything else that would be used therapeutically. Unfortunately, a lot of what happens in vision care is we kind of think about the pharmacy and the fundamental cure, and we don't think as much about the assistive technology side of things. And we're trying to bring a stronger emphasis to that assistive technology to help support function. But again, that works in concert with anything else and wouldn't be a conflict with anything else that would be brought down, down the development pipeline.
Hey, real quickly, we did have a question come in that I think is really important because we do have international people. This is fabulous presentation. Thank you, Adam says. Will this be available in Ireland and Europe?
Good question. We're hoping that it'll be available worldwide. It's a great question. We actually are really happy to report we just landed a grant that is supposed to start probably next week, where we'll be doing a similar some similar work in Thailand, actually. So in Southeast Asia, and we're very excited about that. So absolutely, we're very excited to work with international partners. So if you want to talk more about that, or if you have some inroads with organizations in your country of interest, let us know. Feel free to email me. We have a lab page too, www.rizzolab.org. You can contact us there, but feel free to reach out to me at any point in time.
Awesome.
So the last two were training and then trials. So, the idea with these devices is that we would like them to be adopted as many as possible, and for them to be what I'd consider kind of training light. But, of course, we would work with our orientation and mobility instructors. They've done a fabulous job with supporting the blind and low vision space for decades. And so we are actually working with O&Ms in creating some policies and some procedures for some of these devices right now. They serve on some of our scientific advisory boards, and they're basically stakeholders that have been key to a lot of the process here, and that won't change. In terms of what the training would actually look like, I don't have a definitive answer for you on that, but the idea is for it to kind of be a light framework. So, something that, you could certainly work with an orientation mobility instructor on, but that also could provide data for you and also your instructor. And then excitingly, we're looking at these really neat bidirectional opportunities between pedestrians and also the city. So the city could do more for you and you could do more for the city. And there's these kind of really nice bidirectional opportunities for both. And I think if we think about that through this lens, we're going to be doing the best for everyone in the population, but then also the city will be more incentivized to help support these initiatives more broadly. So that's the one question. And the last question on trials, we don't have any specific clinical trials yet because these are kind of early days in development for a lot of these applications and wearables. But if you have any ideas on thoughts or concepts about how to build or extend the technologies or to apply them into other spaces, we'd be all ears to hear about them. We're at a point right now where we're really building the research program and the research team. And so any other ideas you do have, we'd be all for it. I can't say that we have anything formally recognized on the Office of Clinical Trials right now with the government. In 2 years, there will be one clinical trial that'll come online for this international work that will be designated a clinical trial. But in the meantime, it's just working with us and engaging with us in this early development process and piloting some of the newer mobile applications and the wearables. But again, if there are new ideas, certainly all ears.
That's awesome. I don't even know where to pick it up from there. We don't have any other questions. You covered so many things so quickly. It's a lot to process. And I would imagine people are going to look at this twice and then think about what next steps, that they would like to take personally and maybe be in contact with you.
Sure.
What we do is we send out an informational email to our membership, and we send a link to this video. So what we'll be sure to do too is include all your contact information in that, so people can reach you directly. I'm really excited. I think our community, if I could say this, it's been a hard year, with the gene therapy trials, and we're still progressing in that. Nothing is done. But it sounds like the brakes maybe were pumped a little bit, and reevaluation. So I know that the focus on, if I may say, the foundation's perspective is always in our mission statement is to educate and support our members. So as you mentioned so eloquently, JR, it's just not finding that treatment or that cure, but it's how we can bridge and to support and to encourage everybody, all of us, until that time comes.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, it's interesting that as we've picked up speed and momentum, we've actually had individuals who are just elder adults reach out to us and say, I can tell that I'm losing some function. I'd be interested in using a system like this, even though I don't have a designated visual impairment or a designated disability. I think it would be very assuring to me and improve my confidence. And, what's interesting about that from a mental health and a psychology standpoint is, as you get older in age, even having a trip and fall in kind of one, key event could be extremely alarming and change the kind of psyche. And this concept of fear of falling becomes really profound, and it's a big problem. And then, the immobility problems that ensue, it's extremely difficult. So, the more we could do to get out there and support, and, I like to consider myself kind of someone who's a hyper, kind of hyper functional, one who performs above baseline. Everyone's like, I only have a degree or two essential vision. They're like, how do you manage or, navigate? But still, I find myself oftentimes, if I have the option to stay at home or not engage, I choose not to. I mean, just today, I walked into something to grab a quick bite to lunch in between meetings. I walked into something and hit my head. It's just, there's always something, and you end up wanting to kind of select for the comfort, select for the not having to go out or not, but all those little selections end up adding up. Right. And then it's all the kind of immobility that kind of piles up. And the exciting thing is that technology is here. We have all the fundamental advances we need. It's just more a matter about kind of tying them all up and then putting them in the visually impaired, kind of the packaging, and that's what we're working on. But it's coming. It's a little bit time dependent on resources, but we'll get there. We're stubborn enough to make sure that it crosses the finish line. So
we had another comment from Brent. He said, great presentation. Thank you for walking us through the process of understanding, then developing these kinds of technologies. It helps us visualize the intensity and creativity required to bring these ideas into reality. Thank you. Man, that's a good note to end on, I think.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you, Brent. Yes. Thanks to the CRF family. I really appreciate everything you all do. And let's just keep on moving onward and upward. So thanks very much.
Well, we're absolutely blessed to have you on our bench. So thanks a lot, JR. And just want to say thank you to everybody who's joining us, watching this. Share it. We'll be sharing it, of course, on our social media and on our website and on the YouTube. So thanks again to our sponsors, which would be Biogen, Santen, Genentech, and Spark Therapeutics. Have a great day. Thanks again, JR.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.